thank you, the South Asia Studies, for inviting me, and the Human Rights Program for co-sponsoring, and apparently also providing the lunch for us today, so that was very nice. I don't make it over on this part of campus very often, being over in forest and wildlife ecology, and I wish I made it over more. So I think I actually at some point volunteered to do this. I was getting some emails about something, and I'm like, hey, and by the way, I'd love to give a seminar and come over and get to know all of you better over here. So I'm very happy to be here. Let's see. So I just want to say, who am I? I am a conservation biologist. So area studies is not something that conservation biologists normally get very involved with. I went to school at Minnesota. I knew about the South Asia meeting here in Madison every year. Never came. No one who I worked with in Nepal ever came to it. And then when I moved here, and my sister, who I did a lot of this research with, who some of you may know, Teri Allendorf, she was over in the sociology department, and she's a gender person, which I'm not actually. She started going to those meetings, so I went with her a few times. And it opened up a whole world to me of people who love a place as much as I do and do totally different research there. And so it gave a whole new face. I do a lot of interdisciplinary research, being a conservation biologist, sort of in the midst of all these disciplines. But it was a whole new face to interdisciplinarity. And I'm on the executive committee for the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies now because of going to those meetings and meeting people. And it's interesting because I think area studies there now is really blossoming in terms of being interdisciplinary and having a huge environmental component. And every year we have more and more panels, both at the South Asia meeting and the ANHS meeting, that are really, really exciting. So I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully I know there's people in this room with lots of experience in places that I work and other places, so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you. So I'm a conservation biologist. I do what we call human dimensions, which means I take social science approaches and apply them to conservation biology questions. And I don't know, were any of you here for Paul Robbins' talk at the beginning of the semester? So I listened to his MP3. I wasn't able to come because I was in Nepal then. But it's really exciting also to follow him, right? That's sort of an example of how I think we're beginning to cross over more and better. And I am a conservation biologist, and he made a joke about how they only care about protected areas. I don't think that's true, but I do happen to work in protected areas. And the things I'm interested in are the basic research questions. I want to go through some of my basic research first that sort of leads you into why I began to ask the gender question. So I'm going to show you some results from my larger research questions. How do local residents perceive protected areas? And to answer that, I want to know, what are their attitudes? Do they say they like or dislike, in a very simple social psychology kind of way, a protected area? And then what do they perceive as benefits and problems? What do they think are the good things and bad things about protected areas? And then I want to look at how can we predict the attitude, knowing some socioeconomics, knowing maybe their use of the protected area, their knowledge about it, and then what they perceive as benefits and problems. Can we predict whether people like or dislike protected areas? That's the basic research questions that I'm asking. And so far, I've conducted research on this and surveys of almost 4,000 people around 8 different protected areas, 150 villages in Nepal, Myanmar, and China. I have a little bit on China, but not much today. But if I forget to describe it, ask me if you're interested. And why do I do this research? Because I am a conservation biologist. I want to conserve biodiversity. So I want to find ways to incorporate local communities in protected area management and planning to make it more effective. I want to do better conservation. I want to also make it more efficient. I don't want to waste time doing it. And ethical, right? It comes from both directions. We want to work with people in a more ethical way. We want to include them in things. But we also want to be better at conservation. Why do I work in Asia? There's a lot of all these little red dots are IUCN category protected areas in Asia, and most of the world looks like this if you looked at protected area maps. There's thousands of protected areas all over the place. So Asia's not really special in that. There's a lot of them. There's a lot all over the world. But what is special about Asia, as we all know, is this is the human population density map. So there's a lot of humans living in Asia, and South Asia in particular, and in the Himalayan area here. So you've got a lot of protected areas with a lot more people around them than in most areas of the world. And then also although there's a lot of protected areas everywhere, this Himalayan area where I work and then down into Myanmar are 2 biodiversity hotspots. You have the Indo-Himalayan hotspot, biodiversity hotspot, and you also have the Indo-Burman hotspot. So there's a lot of biodiversity, a lot of people, and they're coming together at protected areas quite often in some pretty hard borders. So I go in and I ask people right around protected areas some basic questions in a survey that doesn't take very long. I ask them some basic socioeconomics questions, age, some wealth questions, education, size of family. I ask them what they see as problems and benefits of protected areas. I ask them, do you like or dislike the area? And then in Nepal and China, we also ask questions about their use and knowledge. These are all open-ended questions, so I'm not asking them a predetermined set of categories. It's totally open-ended. What are the benefits of the protected area? We jot them down open-ended, sort of a qualitative format, although then I turn it into quantitative, okay? Because I group them into categories. So I'm going to go through methods. That was pretty fast, so if you have questions, let me know, but hopefully it's going to make sense without spending too much time on it. The 3 protected areas in Nepal that I've worked in, there's 1 national park, and the other 2 are smaller protected areas. One is more of a natural park that the Forest Department takes care of up in Surkhet in western Nepal. There's Royal Bardia National Park. And then there's 1 Lumbini, which is quite a small protected area, which is part of the Lumbini Development Trust where Buddha was born. So they're developing it as a tourist area, but there's also a conservation area for Saris crane. In Burma, I worked in or Myanmar. I'm not trying to say anything political here by using one or the other, so please don't think too hard about it. I've been working there since '94, so I use both interchangeably at this point. Although Myanmar is probably going to become more official, right? Even the U.S. might start calling it Myanmar. So in there, we've worked in 4 different official IUCN type protected areas, 1 national park and 3 wildlife sanctuaries. So in Nepal, I did all the surveys myself. Because I speak Nepali, so I can go in and do them all just one-on-one with people. In Burma, we use school teachers that we trained who were from one of the protected areas, Chatin, and then they went around to the other protected areas and trained other school teachers. So we're always using men and women. We're using local people there to do the surveys. But it's important to remember the difference in methods in those 2 places when we look at results. And then this is a map of Chatin, just to give you an idea. So in Burma, because I have teams that can go in, we're actually going into every protected area within about 5 kilometers of each area, depending on how many villages there are. In Nepal, I'm doing far fewer since I'm doing them on my own. I want to tell you a little bit about Nepal and Myanmar to set up the results. So Nepal is really progressive in terms of conservation. A lot of you may know how successful they've been. They've got a huge percentage of their land is protected. Here's the map of national parks. They use very innovative approaches. They've got buffer zones around the national parks, which do a lot of conservation and give funds back to communities from national parks. They have a lot of co-managed areas, and they're increasing the number of co-managed areas and the types of forests that are co-managed. And community forestry is extremely successful. And they have a huge emphasis on gender in their community forestry, and a little bit in these areas, but not as much. Community forestry has been very successful in terms of incorporating gender. This is a map of all the community forests across Nepal. So that's been very successful. In contrast, Myanmar, while it has over 50% of the remaining forests in Southeast Asia, so it has a lot of forests, which are probably going to go really rapidly as the regime has changed and foreign investment is coming into it, so that's an issue. They've protected very little of their land, less than 5%, and a lot of it is just paper parks. Very little funding, very little awareness, very little support. So the countries contrast really strongly in those ways. So first, some of the key results, just of the attitudes in general towards protected areas without looking at gender. People have really positive attitudes towards protected areas. So a lot of the research really tries to put up protected areas as really sources of conflict where people really dislike them because they don't have access to resources that they need. But if we just look at attitudes, people are actually quite positive given that, and they also have very complex attitudes. They're positive and negative. It's not just one or the other. So if you just ask people, do you like or dislike the protected area, this is 8 different protected areas that we've done the research in. And the dark blue, is the number that say they like the protected area. So we range from one area, which is nearly 100%, down to another one, which is still nearly 50% of people saying they like it. So that's a lot of positive feelings towards them. And then the lighter blue is the number of people, the percentage of people that have something positive to say. And I'll tell you what these things are in a minute. And the green is the percentage that have also something negative to say, some problem that they perceive. So a lot of responses right across the board. People are thinking a lot of things about their protected areas. So here are the categories, those open-ended verbatim responses that people give us in the survey. We then categorize into some basic categories that probably look familiar if you think about conservation and what benefits there are from conservation. So the first benefit is conservation. People say it's good to conserve the tiger or the elephant or whatever it might be in their protected area, wildlife in general, the forest. People see those as benefits. People talk about ecosystem services. The protected area has a benefit of more water, better cleaner climate for us, cleaner air. They talk about protected area management sometimes providing benefits to them, such as some employment, building roads in the area for them to use. In Nepal in particular, we see a lot of people saying recreation. In Nepal, they have a culture of going for picnics, as some of you may know. They really enjoy their forest. They enjoy going out in groups into the forest. They say it's beautiful, it's green, it's just a nice thing to have. We did not see this in Myanmar so much, so that's an interesting difference between the two countries. In fact, we didn't see it at all in Myanmar. And extraction. Extraction is a benefit, especially in areas where there's a pretty hard boundary of agriculture land outside the protected area and then forest inside. People have no choice but to go there. And that's a benefit. And they tell you quite openly that's a benefit, right? They're not trying to hide, really, that they're extracting from the areas. Some of the problems that you would expect and that people mention are wildlife damage. If the protected area has wildlife that either kill people or eat crops or kill livestock, they mention that as a problem. They also mention no extraction as a problem, the fact that they can't legally extract. And they also mention protected area management in terms of, they say, protected area management fines us, they may beat us, they give us problems, they won't let us in. So those are the main categories that come out of the survey. So people generally have positive attitudes, they have complex attitudes, they see positive and negative. And then when we run logistic regression analyses, we put all those variables I talked about into the logistic regression model and say, okay, can we predict whether people like or dislike it? The key variable that comes out over and over again that accounts for most of people liking an area is if they perceive conservation and or ecosystem service benefits. So people who do see these as benefits, this outweighs education, it outweighs wealth, it outweighs any of the socioeconomic variables you can throw in. It also outweighs all the other perceptions in terms of predicting who's going to like it. These are important perceptions for them to have. So this is to show you how many people in each protected area perceive conservation and ecosystem service benefits. And it ranges from a high, this is a protected area in China, from 80%, down to Lumbini, which is only about 12%. And it's interesting that I put them in order and they actually fall out in order of country. I'm not going to go into China because that's sort of just one protected area. But I do want to mention that in Nepal, I think the numbers are low. First of all, because this is the area where they're also seeing a lot of recreational and aesthetic benefits. So when you ask an open-ended question like, what are the benefits? People sort of satiate, right? They give you 2, 3 responses, the first things that are most salient in their head. And in Nepal, half of those are like recreation and aesthetic benefits that they're mentioning. Whereas in Burma, they're not mentioning them. So I think they're giving more of these. So that's sort of like a methods issue in terms of why there's some difference there. And then these two areas are probably also small because they're very small, physically small areas. So they're not providing many ecosystem service benefits, and they're not really protecting large wildlife or anything. So they really are providing fewer of those benefits. And then the next thing I want to mention, so many people have a positive attitude. They're more likely to have that if they receive conservation ecosystem service benefits. And the more knowledge they have about the protected area, the more likely they are to see these types of benefits. So the more, when we ask questions like, do you know when the area was, when it was protected, when it was created, do you know who created it, do you know why it was created? The more people know about it, the more likely they are to see conservation ecosystem service benefits. Okay, so that's sort of like a whirlwind summary of that research. But then I wanted to think about, do men and women see them differently? Because my sister, as I said, is a sociologist, works on gender issues. I said, wow, that'd be a really interesting question. Especially for me, I work a lot, in these protected areas, and I work with all men, right? And even in what I do, it's mainly men. You work on tigers in Nepal, it's all men. There are very few women. So at all issues of wildlife, there's this gender difference that's going on. So I was very interested in looking on the ground and seeing what was happening in terms of people's attitudes. And I was also interested, again, because gender-sensitive approaches can help women, right? It can promote more socially just conservation, can more equitably distribute benefits that are happening in buffer zones, for example, and can help mitigate costs. Women often suffer more of the costs of conservation because of having to go get fuel wood from the forest or having to help protect livestock or something. So they have a lot of the burden of conservation. So that's sort of from the ethics standpoint why we might want to do it. But then as a conservationist, there's research that's coming out that shows you do better conservation. So as a biologist, you should care about what women think because it can help you. So Westerman, in looking across 20 countries around the world, has found that natural resource management groups with women have higher levels of collaboration, solidarity, they're better able to resolve conflicts. So that's more process variables, right? But Agarwal in Nepal and India has found that women's participation in forestry groups, where it's quite high in many of the areas, results in better forest condition. So if there's more women involved, the forest is actually healthier, both in terms of conserving what was there, but actually regeneration. Women's forests where women are involved have quicker rates of regeneration than ones without. And part of that is because forest groups with women have more forest patrolling. They're more actively patrolling and protecting, and better rule compliance. Maybe because women all know the rules better. If they're involved in managing it, they know the rules. They're more likely to help make sure people follow the rules. So that's really good news for a conservation biologist. It's good to know that. So I went back and looked at my data and said, okay, let's look at Myanmar. We'll look at that first, and then let's look at Nepal and see what's happening. So in Myanmar, is there a gender gap in attitude in terms of like and dislike? And yes, we can see 70% of men say they like the protected area, and 58% of women say they don't, say they like it, and so that is significantly different. So there's a gender gap. And if you look at their perceptions of the area, their problems and benefits that they perceive, we can see there's also a gender gap there. So this is the percentage of men in this column who see each category of benefit and problem, and this is the percentage of women, and they're all significantly different except for perceptions of conflict with wildlife, which is the same. And other studies have actually found this too. This is one kind of category of problem that men and women seem to see equally. But all the others are different, and they're all different in the same direction. So in every case, it's women mentioning everything less. Right, so that's an interesting component. They're just saying fewer things in the survey. I forgot to. And there's a whole bunch of other analysis we did called decomposition analysis to see which of the variables accounts for most of this difference between how many like the area. And when we do that, we see that conservation and ecosystem service benefits account for most of that difference. So when we do this analysis, it shows us that of like the 12 of the amount of, let's see, where am I? Of the like and dislike, there's 12 percentage points different in terms of men and women, and 10 of those are accounted for just by conservation ecosystem service benefits. So if women saw this as frequently as men, they would almost be even in terms of liking the area, we would predict. So that's accounting for a lot of that, which again is like the overall results of how important that perception is to attitude. So in Myanmar, women are less likely to like the areas. They're less likely to give responses to the survey in terms of problems and benefits, and their perception of conservation and ecosystem service benefits explain a large portion of that gap. So in Nepal, do we see a gap? In Nepal, no, we don't see a gap in attitude. About the same percentage of men and women say they like the protected area. There's no gap there. If we look at perceptions, we see that there's a lot of significant differences between men and women in terms of their perceptions. And it's not like Myanmar, though, which is nice, right? It's not just women responding less to the survey and giving fewer answers for some reason. In the case of women in Nepal, more of them are mentioning extraction being a problem. Fewer of them are mentioning management and wildlife being a problem, although wildlife, again, is not significantly different, just like in Myanmar. And in terms of benefits, fewer women are saying conservation benefits, but we have more women mentioning extraction, although it's not significant, and fewer mentioning recreation. So it's a little bit more of a complicated pattern in terms of gender than in Myanmar. And we also have other data for Nepal. We have their use measures. So what do people say they enter for? And there are some significant differences here. Women are entering a lot more for fuel wood, like I mentioned. That's their responsibility in Nepal. About the same numbers for thatch, which is, as some of you may know, legally extracted in Nepal from protected areas. There's a program for it. The men are mentioning going through the area just for traveling, like to get from one place to another, they go through the protected area. And more men are mentioning recreation, but it's not significant. So they are using the areas differently. And in terms of knowledge, we also see major differences. And this actually is a pretty consistent pattern, and women just know less about the protected area. Fewer of them know the correct name of the protected area. Fewer of them say they understand the rules. More of them say they don't know, or they mention some entity who created it, which is not correct. Although still over half are saying national government, which is correct. They're giving fewer reasons, number of reasons for the creation. So I asked, why was the area created? Most of the reasons are correct, right? Because there's a lot of reasons why protected areas are created. So I couldn't really do a right or wrong. I just did how many reasons did they give, right? How salient was that question to them? And women give fewer responses to that than men. And the reason for creation, the top 3 reasons are not significantly different for men and women. So I've just put the ones that were different. In one of the areas, like I mentioned, Lumbini is a Buddhist area, so more men are mentioning that as a reason. More men are mentioning outsiders, like tourists, for example, or researchers. They're thinking more in that more external way about the protected area. More of them are mentioning development. A couple of the areas have a temple which is protected. The men are mentioning that more. Here's an interesting one, though. Women mention that people degraded the area and we need to protect it for later way more often than men. And there's another study in Nepal which has also found that women were much more sensitive to this fact, that the areas were degraded because of their own community's behavior in the areas around it, which is very interesting. And then people also say, oh, just for its own benefit, which is not a very meaningful answer. And then they're also not significantly different in saying, it's protected in order to see it or for future benefits. So for Nepal then, because there's no difference in attitude, we couldn't do a decomposition analysis to look at what's accounting for the difference. What we can do is run logit models to look at, as we control for different variables, what happens to the effect of women. So in the bivariate, which means we're just looking at, does gender predict like and dislike? As I said, there's no difference, right? So the odds ratio, women they're 1.05 times more likely than men to say they like the area, which is not significant, of course. If we control for the socioeconomic variables, women are 1.41 times more likely to say they like the area than we would predict given socioeconomic variables, such as they do have less education, right? That usually means that you're less likely to like a protected area because you know less. In this case, they're still liking the area more than men. If we control for knowledge about the protected area, again, not significant, but almost twice as likely to like the area than men. If we control for use, they are significantly more likely to like the area than men, than we would predict. They're twice as likely as men, given the fact that, remember, they complained about not being able to extract legally? That tends to make them more negative, and yet there's still really high numbers of women saying they like it. And then when we account for perceptions, remember, fewer of them are mentioning a lot of those positive things like conservation, and the fact that they can't extract. But they're 3 times more likely than we would predict to say they like the area, given all these sort of negative facets of their relationship. So they're really positive towards the protected areas compared to what we would predict. So when we compare the 2 areas, in Myanmar, women are more negative. They give fewer responses to the survey. In Nepal, there's no gap in attitude. They're way more positive, and they're responding really well to the survey in terms of answers. And one thing I want to throw out, maybe I should throw out the next one, actually. So what are some of my hypotheses for this? These are pretty complex things. There's a lot going on. And when I look at the literature on environment and gender and surveys, so I looked at literature on gender and surveys, gender and environment, gender and attitudes towards the environment. And there's a lot of different things that can help explain it. And I just want to throw some of them out there. One thing to keep in mind about Nepal and Myanmar I want to say first is that those results are really not what we would predict given what we sort of know generally about the 2 countries. Myanmar is much more, Southeast Asia in general is more egalitarian. Women tend to be more educated relative to women in South Asia. They tend to be more involved in what's going on. So you wouldn't predict the women to be I almost predict them to be more equal than in Nepal, and it's the opposite. So that's sort of an interesting thing to think about, right? The role I talk about, the social status in society, I think everything sort of hooks into that somehow with these gender issues. But they actually had the opposite status of what you would expect. But there hasn't been much research done in Myanmar, right? That's really going to start happening now that it's opened up. So there's not much to look at. It's a lot of sort of generalizations about it, right? So it's hard to sort of pick apart what some of the more specific things might be that affect women in the rural areas in Myanmar and how they're interacting with the protected area. Okay, so some of the things, my hypotheses for these differences are, how the women are responding to the survey. So that's explaining some of it, because in Myanmar, it's a pretty clear pattern that they're just not giving as many answers to the survey. And because I had school teachers doing it, it could work 2 ways, right? The women themselves might just be less responsive in Myanmar. They probably have less experience with surveys, less experience with that sort of work, less experience with protected areas. In Nepal, around the protected areas, some of them, there's some surveys that have been done around Bardia. They're more used to development projects, and so there might be just some more awareness of surveys and how to respond. So they themselves might be reacting differently. Although generally what happens is women do respond less in general. And in Nepal, they're not doing that, really. So maybe that's because I was doing the interviews and I'm a foreigner and I'm speaking Nepali, and that gets them pretty excited. And maybe I'm pausing that much longer to give them a chance to give me more responses. I'm expecting responses from the women, whereas the school teachers in Myanmar, also, they have their own gender expectations. They might not be pausing as long. They might not be sort of following up as much. These subtle differences in how you ask the questions. That could be a huge part of it. Access to information in both countries is key. Women just don't have as much access to information in order to answer the questions, as we saw. The way information comes down through communities, it comes from the high level down to lower, and it's usually passing through men every step of the way. There's a study in China that's really pointed this out clearly, that women, everyone thinks the men go home and tell women what happened in the community forestry meeting or whatever, and they don't. We all know they don't. They don't tell women what happened, right? So women just don't have access to knowledge. So they just don't feel, so they don't feel like they know the answers to the questions you're asking, right? But another interesting aspect of this is that this is true in developed countries too. When you look at wildlife surveys, in fact, we were just talking about this, in wildlife surveys, even in the US and developed countries, women do not respond as often. So if you send a survey out to households, the woman will hand it, it'll come to the household, address to the household, head of household or whatever. The woman will just hand it to the man, like, oh, it's about the wolves, or it's about wildlife, or it's about, those are just areas that even in the US, we still have a gender bias in terms of who we think knows about those things or cares about those things. We all know with hunting, right, there's many more male hunters. The women hunters are increasing as the male hunters decrease, but there are a lot of gender issues even here when it comes to wildlife. So that could be part of the answer, just how much people think they know about it, how much access to information they feel they have. Another interesting aspect is attitude towards environment, and there's been a lot of research on this, which is some of it shows that women are much more pro-environment in terms of attitude and behaviors. Some of it shows they're not. It's pretty complex. There's no clear answer. There's not been much done in developing countries to really look at attitudes toward the environment in general. Most of it's in developed countries. But one study I thought was interesting said that women may have a more pro-environmental attitude, but if we compare them to other non-white men, and we have groups, so we compare women to other kinds of people, other ethnicities, what we really see is that white men in the US, for example, have a different attitude than everybody else, which in this particular study they ascribe to social status. That people of lower social status are just much more aware of interdependencies and the need for resources and to share resources, and so that makes them more pro-environmental because they're more aware of all those connections. That's an interesting study. So it's really not a gender issue then, right? Maybe really it is just social status. So again, if women were of equal social status, they may feel pretty similarly to men. We don't know. Right? It's a possibility. They may not be innately different in any way. And then in the case of these two countries or anywhere, just the household role. What are the expectations of women and how does that affect what they think? So in terms of the fuel wood extraction, they're the ones who have to go into the park. They interact with the management in a different way when they're getting arrested or fined. There's just sort of household roles and expectations that affect how they think about the park, and again also affects how they're going to respond to the survey and what they think their role is in terms of responding to the survey. So there's all this stuff that is impacting it. And the two countries, it's interesting to compare them because you can see how when I wrote two different papers on each one, so each paper has its nice theory on what's causing it, right? But then you put it together and you're like, now you've got these two really different stories, and how do you really explain those differences? It's not very easy. So management implications, since I'm a conservation biologist, what would I, as a manager, as a biologist, want to do with this kind of information generally? Well, I would say first, both countries show you need more information and more outreach to women. You need it to everybody, right? It helps everyone who knows about the protected area has a better attitude. So more information, more interaction, especially in developing countries. Management is not trained in this. They don't interact. There's not much outreach, not much education unless it's NGOs doing outreach. But that would be really key to improving people's attitudes. And then definitely increase women's involvement. And I'm going to talk about this more in the Nepal context because Nepal is so progressive in terms of gender. I don't know how many of you are experienced with Nepal, but given its development status, it's amazing. So in community forestry, for years they've required representation by women on the community forestry committees at all levels. And 30%, then they made it a lot, it had to be 30% representation. Now they're going to 50%. And they're also trying to translate that into national policies. 50% women on all committees all over Nepal. I'm not sure the status of this. Maybe some of you keep up with it a little better. Every time I go back, they're still sort of talking about it like it's being written, it's being drafted, but it's not yet approved. So that you're going to have 50% representation, and I think it's still unclear exactly where. All levels of government, all committees, all sorts of, what does that mean? But they know it. They're so aware of it. There's so much awareness about gender. But then, when you look at protected areas, so they have community forestry in protected areas in Nepal, in the buffer zones. But for some reason, they did not take their national community forestry policy and apply that to the community forests and buffer zones. So they have no gender policy about community forests in buffer zones. So boom, all of a sudden, you don't have as many women participating. You don't have them on there's all these buffer zone committees, which they did not apply the gender policies to. So there's really a complex system of buffer zone management committees with local representation at all scales so they have these women and men's group at the village level, but above that, there are no policies. So there's very few women participating or having a voice. So it's just a strange sort of dichotomy between the two. And I asked the national park people, I'm like, you guys, you work with these community foresters. You know it worked. You know Nepal is held up for this. Why don't you do it? And they're like, well, we're national parks. We're wildlife. We're just years behind. Community forestry is out there, and we're back here, and we're trying to deal with a lot of other issues, right? They do have a lot of other management issues that they're trying to deal with. Their world is a little more complex than foresters, but it would be easier if they learned lessons and applied them. So I think it's coming. It just hasn't happened yet. And then there's these weird, every ministry has a gender representative, and they're writing gender policies in every ministry. But you have these, they haven't translated yet into policies. And then, for example, in the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, you have one woman sitting, well, there was one woman sitting in the office, the main office in Kathmandu, and she left to go study because she was sort of sick of the gender things that were going on. For example, well, how was she supposed to, she had a small child, she wanted a better education, so she went to Australia. But she said things were killing her, like there's allowance for uniforms, right? Everyone in the Nepali government, you get some kind of allowance for uniforms, and in DNPWC, the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, the men get an allowance for 3 uniforms. And they can mix and match, like the office versus the field, or there's some choices in the uniform. The women get 2 uniforms allotted to them, money for, and they have to choose either 2 saris or 2 kurta sarwals. So they need a kurta sarwal for the field, or they need field clothes, which won't get reimbursed at all. And then they need a sari for the office. So she's like, what is that all about? Why this? So there's very few women in those higher levels, and the policies are not conducive to them at all. So again, at the ground level, we're almost doing better in a place like Nepal than we are higher up. And then in Nepal, you see that most of the gender focus is still on local level in terms of these local level committees, and then domestic violence, human trafficking, all those things we traditionally associate with women, right? It's women in violence, women in lower status, and again, I feel like we hold ourselves back sometimes because we focus on those, and we're not dealing with a lot of the issues that are higher level issues for women that are really important. So I just I was just in Chitwan National Park, and there was somebody from the Conflict Resolution Center in Santa Barbara, and she was doing a workshop with women, and it was supposed to be about women entrepreneurs and sort of getting them more, so they were bringing together local women who had small businesses and trying to build their capacity, and it was just so interesting watching it because as soon as a woman talked about like domestic violence or the things her husband was doing to her to hold her back, you could just see that the woman from Kathmandu who ran an NGO and then the American woman were like, oh, domestic violence, quick, sexual violence. And those buzzwords that we think about women are the things that really got them going. And they weren't as interested in sort of the higher level, how do we connect with other women entrepreneurs, how do we get policies. I mean, there's sort of an interesting discrepancy between what we allow women, what we think the issues for women are in a developing country and what they may actually perceive the issues to be. Which is true of protected area issues too, right? In protected area issues, we as outsiders sort of focus on a lot of the negative things, right, in terms of wildlife conflict, why they should be upset about them. And there's actually a lot of other things going on that we're ignoring. So it's a complex thing. And so in Nepal, we need to focus on these things, but we need to figure out how to get more women into Department of National Parks and Wildlife too, and some of those higher level, more maybe even more difficult issues in some ways. Okay. And then, again, just to make one more point about, even in Norway, one of the most egalitarian countries in the world, someone did a study on women's involvement in protected areas and found that women, they were creating 2 or 3 new protected areas, and they looked at how women got involved, how many women were involved, and basically there were very few, like 20, if you look at all the men involved, 20, or all the people involved, 20% were women, and the main reason they seem to think was just because no one thinks to ask women, and women don't think of coming forward. It's just not an issue they think of as their purview yet. So again, this is, these are not just Nepal and Myanmar issues. These are everywhere. Women are not as involved in this type of stuff as they should be. And then to tie it into the human rights, because protected areas in Nepal, the human rights aspects, which I know almost nothing about, but I hit my head against it a lot, because when you're working in protected areas there, this ILO 169, I don't know how many of you know about ILO 169, which is an international labor organization that different countries sign their like standards, and one of them, 169, focuses on indigenous rights, and that indigenous people have rights that need to be acknowledged. So Nepal has signed that. And so with the legacy of the Maoist conflict just ending and this process of creating a new government, this indigenous rights, issues of federalization have become really central. And you hear people talk about ILO 169 all the time. And this comes down to the protected area level then, where you hear this at the protected area level. So there's a lot of focus on the minority groups there, the ethnic groups, like the fishermen, the different sort of groups that have had a harder time transitioning into protected areas and buffer zones because the river runs through the protected area and they can't fish anymore. Well, if they can't fish, what can they do? And there hasn't been very much focus on them. And so in terms of protected areas, the ILO, the indigenous rights, human rights issues have, I think, in some ways almost subsumed women's issues because there's all this focus on this now. And you have these human rights groups. So there's a group from Kathmandu that again, I only know from the ground level, and I haven't been able to sort of top down figure out what's really going on. But what I hear at the ground level is, so these fishermen's groups, these different groups, are agitating. There's been violence against park wardens and other staff because they want their rights to these. They want their rights, which is another story I want to mention real quick. And so it's these external groups from Kathmandu. I've heard they'll hire people from like Bularia, which is a little ways away from Bardia National Park. They hire some people from there who are like human rights people. They go into Bardia, they talk to the fishermen, they say, you need to go out and protest in the road. We have to have a strike tomorrow. And they go out and strike. And so it's an externally, so for me as a conservation biologist, it's interesting because Nepal has done, they could do a lot better job of working with local communities in all levels, especially indigenous communities. But I think they honestly are trying as well as most countries are in some, many respects. So then you have these external organizations sort of under the table sort of making these real issues. And it's just sort of an interesting phenomenon that I wish I knew more about. So if any of you know more about that, please tell me. I'd be interested to learn more. And the other thing I see in Nepal with the rights issues is that I've worked at all scales in Nepal, from local level in this research. I now work there on different projects in Chitwan and Bardia and the Eastern Tribe. And I've also done consultancies for USAID. I did their biodiversity and forestry review. And at all levels, I hear people talk about rights to protected areas. And then I went to Namibia in the fall. And when I heard rights, I also always heard the word responsibilities. There's rights and there's responsibilities. And it was just interesting to me that in Nepal, it's all about rights now. It's not about responsibility. No one's really talking about that. It's my right to something. And then there was Namibia where they were using both together. And so I think rights in Nepal, which some of you probably know a lot more about than I do, is a really interesting issue that's impacting protected areas in ways that's hard for a conservation biologist to really understand all the ramifications. So there's a good, and again, it's making people not think about women's rights. I think it's sort of diverting some attention away from them. And that's it. Thank you very much.